I bought a used car. The previous owner left a secret message for me in the GPS. At first, I dismissed it. It was probably just an old address a family forgot to delete. The car was a simple, reliable model. Nothing fancy. I bought it because my old one finally gave up and I needed something to get to work. I'm Walter, just a regular guy living a quiet life. A life that had been quiet for the 5 years since my younger brother David was gone. His business failed, and the shame was too much for him. That was the story everyone knew. That was the story I had forced myself to believe. I bought a used car and found a chilling message from the previous owner about my deceased brother David. It mentioned Arthur, his partner, lied. Subscribe and like to uncover the truth hidden in 4 secret locations. A few days after buying the car, I was playing around with the dashboard controls. I opened the navigation menu and saw a single saved trip labeled for the next owner. My curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. It wasn't a trip, but a list of 4 saved locations and a short text note. The note was simple and chilling. It said, "Arthur lied about David. Go to these places. The truth is at the last stop. Be careful." My heart felt like it stopped beating. Arthur was my brother's former business partner. He was the one who came to the funeral looking so sad, telling everyone how he tried to save the company, how David just wasn't cut out for the pressure. The first address was an old, abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town. I drove there the next Saturday, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The place was boarded up, but a side door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled of damp concrete and decay. In a rusty locker, just as the GPS note described, I found a small, water-damaged notebook. It was David's. I recognized his handwriting. Most of it was just numbers and business notes, but on the last page he wrote, "Arthur is moving money. He created a ghost company. I have no proof, just my gut. He thinks I'm an idiot." My brother wasn't a failure. He was on to something. The second location was a small coffee shop across the country, a place David had never mentioned. I couldn't just drive there. I had to book a flight. It felt crazy, like I was chasing ghosts based on a message from a stranger, but I had to know. The coffee shop was a small, cozy place. I showed a picture of David and Arthur to the old woman behind the counter. Her name was Gladys. She remembered them. "They used to come in here a lot a few years back," she said, wiping a cup. The younger one, David, he was always so hopeful. The other one, Arthur, had cold eyes. I heard them arguing once. A big fight. David was yelling about forged signatures. The third address was a post office box in another city. This was getting stranger and more expensive. Inside the box, there was only a single key with a tag on it. The tag had a number and the name of a self-storage company. This was the final stop. The storage facility was on the outskirts of my own city, a place I'd passed 1,000 times without a second thought. My whole body was tense as I drove there. I felt like I was in some kind of movie. The key slid into the lock of Unit 237 and turned easily. The metal door rolled up with a loud groan, revealing a dark space filled with a few dusty boxes. In the largest box, I found everything. There were stacks of bank statements showing transfers to offshore accounts under Arthur's name. There were copies of contracts with my brother's signature, but they were clearly faked. I'm no expert, but even I could see the difference from the signature in the notebook. And then at the very bottom, there was a small digital audio recorder. I pressed play. A woman's voice spoke first. "My name is Sharon. I was Arthur's assistant. I couldn't go to the police. He threatened my family, but I couldn't live with what he did to David. He drove that poor man to ruin, then bought out the company for pennies with the money he stole." Then I heard Arthur's voice. It was a recording of a phone call. "David is gone," Arthur said, his voice smooth and evil. "It's a tragedy, of course, but a necessary one. He was getting too close. Now the company is all mine, just like it should have been from the start." The recording ended. I stood there in the cold, dusty storage unit, shaking with a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. My brother hadn't failed. He was destroyed. He was erased by the man who called him a friend, the man who patted my shoulder at the funeral. The quiet life I had built was over. Now there was only one thing to do. I didn't want a messy, violent revenge. That wasn't my style, and it wouldn't honor David. I wanted to take from Arthur what he took from my brother. His name, his reputation, everything he built on a foundation of lies. I spent the next month planning. I found out that Arthur was about to be honored at a huge charity gala, receiving an award for Businessman of the Year. He was going to be on a stage, in front of everyone who mattered in his world. It was the perfect stage for his downfall. I made dozens of copies of the documents and the audio recording. I sent them in anonymous packages to every major news outlet in the country, timed to be delivered the morning of the gala. I also sent a copy to the board of directors of his company and to the organizers of the charity event. I didn't want him to just be embarrassed. I wanted him to be legally and financially ruined. I wanted every person who ever admired him to see the monster he was. The night of the gala, I sat in my car across the street from the fancy hotel. I watched on my phone as a live stream of the event began. Arthur walked onto the stage to thunderous applause applause, smiling that big fake smile of his. He started his acceptance speech, talking about integrity and hard work. Halfway through his speech, phones started buzzing in the audience. Whispers turned into loud murmurs. An event organizer ran onto the stage and spoke urgently to Arthur. The smile on his face melted. It was replaced by a mask of pure panic and confusion. He was pulled off the stage as chaos erupted in the hall. News alerts started popping up on my phone. Business mogul Arthur accused of fraud and foul play in partner's death. Charity gala ends in scandal. I watched as reporters swarmed the hotel entrance. I saw Arthur being escorted out a back door, hiding his face from the cameras. It was over. His empire, built on my brother's pain, crumbled in a single night. In the weeks that followed, the story was everywhere. Federal investigators opened a case. His assets were frozen. His partners abandoned him. My brother's name was finally cleared. He was remembered not as a failure, but as a victim of a terrible betrayal. The revenge didn't bring David back, but it gave him back his honor. It brought me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in 5 years. I never found out who Sharon was, and I never tried. She gave me the tools, but the choice to use them was mine. Sometimes I drive the car that started it all, and I think about how a simple machine, sold by a stranger, delivered a justice that the world had forgotten. And for the first time since I lost my brother, the road ahead feels clear. The engine of the car was a low hum in the silence of the night. I sat there for what felt like hours, just watching the flashing lights of police cars and news vans paint the hotel front in chaotic strokes of red and blue. The storm I had unleashed was now a spectacle for the world, but inside my car, there was only a profound stillness. The burning rage that had fueled me for a month had cooled, leaving behind something heavy and solid like a stone settling at the bottom of a river. It wasn't happiness. It was the quiet, grim satisfaction of a debt finally paid. My brother David couldn't be brought back, but his ghost could finally rest. His name was clean. That was the only victory that mattered. The following morning, my phone began ringing before the sun was even fully up. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize. A calm, steady voice introduced himself. "My name is Raymond. I'm an attorney. I represent a group of former investors from your brother's company. We saw the news. We think you and I should talk." I agreed to meet him that afternoon. Raymond was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a presence that was both reassuring and sharp. He laid out the situation clearly. The documents I released were a bombshell. Federal investigators were already moving to freeze all of Arthur's assets. "You didn't just expose a man, Walter," Raymond said, looking at me over his glasses. "You took down a whole criminal operation disguised as a business. But they will come for you. They'll want to know who you are. We need to get ahead of it." For the next few weeks, my life was a blur of legal meetings. I handed over all the original evidence to Raymond, who worked with the authorities. I became a protected witness, my identity kept from the public. During this time, I received an anonymous email. The sender said he used to work for Arthur and that he was one of the few people David trusted in the company's final months. He wanted to meet. His name was Ethan. We met in a public park, sitting on a bench far from anyone else. He was young, probably not much older than David had been. His eyes were full of a sadness that I knew all too well. David knew, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. He knew Arthur was stealing, but he couldn't prove it. The day before he was gone, he told me he had found the final piece of the puzzle. He said, "I've got him, Ethan. Tomorrow it all ends." Ethan explained that David had planned to confront Arthur the next day with evidence of the forged signatures, but he never got the chance. Arthur must have found out. The story of David's failure was a lie Arthur created to cover his tracks. Ethan had been too scared to come forward back then. Arthur had threatened him just like he had threatened Sharon. "I've lived with this guilt for 5 years, Ethan said, tears welling up in his eyes. "Seeing what you did, it gave me the courage to finally speak up." His testimony became a key part of the prosecution's case against Arthur, adding a personal, human element to the cold, hard numbers on the bank statements. He told the investigators everything he remembered David saying, painting a picture of my brother not as a failure, but as a hero, trying to do the right thing. The news of the scandal reached my family, and the old wounds were torn open again. I had to sit down with my parents and tell them everything, from the message in the car's GPS to the dusty boxes in the storage unit. My uncle, Henry, who was always skeptical of Arthur's smooth talk, was there too. He listened to the whole story, his hands clenched into fists. "I never trusted that man," Henry said, his voice thick with anger. "He had the eyes of a shark. I told your father, but nobody wanted to believe it. It was easier to believe the story of a tragic failure. There were tears, of course. My mother cried for the son she had mourned under false pretenses. My father sat in silence, the weight of his own guilt visible on his face for having believed the lie. But through the pain, there was also a sense of relief. The truth, however ugly, was out. I never saw Arthur in person again, but I watched his trial on television. He looked like a different person. The confident, charming businessman was gone, replaced by a pale, thin man who couldn't look anyone in the eye. He was a hollow shell, his empire of lies reduced to nothing. He was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and other financial crimes. The judge's words were harsh, speaking of a profound betrayal that went beyond money. Arthur was sentenced to decades in prison, a life sentence in all but name. Watching him being being led away in handcuffs. I felt nothing, no joy, no hatred, just emptiness. The chapter was finally, truly closed. In the end, I never found out who Sharon was or who sold me the car. I decided it was better that way. They were quiet heroes who lit the fuse, and they deserved their peace. One day, I placed a small anonymous ad in the personal section of a national newspaper. It simply said, "To the previous owner of the blue sedan, the truth found its way. Thank you." I hoped, somehow, that she would see it. The legal battles ended, and the media storm died down. The money that Arthur stole was partially recovered, and a fund was set up for the employees and investors he had cheated. My brother's company was gone, but his honor was restored. Life slowly found a new normal. It wasn't the quiet, numb existence I had before. The peace I felt now was different. It was earned. It was real. I started a small fund in David's name, using some of the settlement money to provide grants to young entrepreneurs starting their first businesses, helping them avoid the predators of the corporate world. I kept the car. Sometimes, on a quiet Sunday, I take it for a long drive with no destination in mind. It's just a simple machine, but it carried a message of truth that changed everything. It reminds me that justice can sometimes be found in the most unexpected places, waiting patiently for the next owner to turn the key. The road ahead is long, but for the first time in 5 years, it feels completely clear. The fund I started in David's name became my anchor. It was a small operation, run out of a tiny rented office, but it felt more real than anything I had done in my life. I would meet young people with fire in their eyes and ideas that sounded both brilliant and impossible. I'd listen to their plans, offering not just money, but the hard-won lesson my brother had learned too late. Trust is more valuable than any contract. I wasn't just writing checks. I was trying to build a small wall of protection around them, the kind of wall David never had. My life had found a new, quiet rhythm, built on the ruins of Arthur's empire. The rage was gone, replaced by a steady, focused purpose. One Tuesday afternoon, a young woman walked into my office. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with a nervous energy about her. She introduced herself as Lauren. "I read about what you did," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "About Arthur and your brother. My father was his partner before David." My heart skipped a beat. I had never heard of any other partners. "My dad's name was Donald," she continued, her eyes glistening. "He lost everything. Arthur told him he was a terrible businessman, that he had ruined them both. My father believed him. He spent the last 10 years of his life working a low-wage job, convinced he was a failure." Lauren slid a worn photograph across my desk. It showed 2 smiling men in their late 30s standing in front of a construction site. One was a younger, less polished Arthur. The other, I presumed, was her father, Donald. "Arthur used the same trick on him," Lauren explained. "He created fake invoices, moved money around, and made it look like my dad was incompetent. He bankrupted him and then bought the company's assets for almost nothing. That company was the foundation of the empire you destroyed." She told me she had spent years trying to piece it all together, but she never had concrete proof, just a daughter's intuition and a father's broken spirit. "When I saw the news about you, it was like a ghost from the past had finally been caught." I listened to her story, and the old cold feeling began to creep back into my veins. I thought I had cut the head off the snake, but now I was learning it had other nests. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I think I already knew the answer. "Because Arthur didn't do it alone," she said, leaning forward. "There was always someone else, a shadow partner who handled the dirty work, the parts that couldn't be traced back to Arthur. My father used to mention a name, Frank. He said Frank was the one who could make problems disappear. He was the one who threatened my dad when he started asking too many questions." A new name, Frank. It felt like a loose thread on a sweater, and I knew if I pulled it, the whole thing might unravel again. I had found my peace. I had cleared David's name. Was this my fight to continue? I looked at Lauren, at the same pain and determination I had seen in my own reflection for 5 long years. I couldn't turn away. My revenge on Arthur was for David, but this felt different. This was about justice for others who had suffered in silence. "What do you want to do?" I asked her. "I want to find him," she said, her voice steely. "I want to expose him, not just for my father, but for your brother and anyone else this man has hurt." We started digging. It was harder this time. Frank was, as Lauren described, a ghost. He had no official connection to any of Arthur's companies. His name appeared nowhere on the documents I had found. It was Lauren who had the first breakthrough. She remembered her father mentioning a specific bar where Arthur and Frank used to meet, a place far from their usual business circles. We went there one night. It was a dim, smoky place that smelled of stale beer. We showed Frank's name to the old bartender, a man named Stanley, who looked like he'd been part of the furniture for decades. "Don't know a Frank," he grunted, wiping a glass. But as we were about to leave, he called out, "Wait, you mean Frank with the scar on his hand? The one who always drank the expensive stuff with Arthur?" That was our first real lead, a physical description. Stanley told us they hadn't been in for years, but he remembered them celebrating big one night, laughing about some fool who signed his life away. The description of Frank, combined with the timeline, allowed us to search old public public records and corporate filings in a new light. We weren't looking for a business partner. We were looking for a fixer. I reached out to my lawyer, Raymond, and told him what we were doing. He was cautious. "Walter, be careful," he warned. "Arthur was a white-collar criminal. A man like Frank, if he exists, could be something far more dangerous. These are deep waters." Our search led us to a man named Frank Russell, a so-called consultant with a history of dissolving companies and a reputation for intimidation. He had a faint scar on his left hand, visible in a grainy photo from an old business journal. He was clean on paper, but the trail of failed businesses and ruined lives he left behind was long. The final piece came from Ethan. I called him, hoping he might remember something. He did. "David mentioned a Frank once," Ethan said after a long pause. David had found a weird payment to a consulting firm. It was a huge amount for no clear reason. He thought it was the money Arthur was using to hide his stealing. He was going to investigate that company the week he was gone. It all clicked into place. Frank wasn't just a partner. He was the architect of the scheme. He taught Arthur how to create the ghost companies, how to forge the signatures, how to legally dismantle a man's life and leave him with nothing but shame. He was the mastermind who stayed in the shadows while Arthur played the public role of the successful tycoon. We had everything we needed. We had Lauren's testimony, the bartender's story, Ethan's memory, and the financial trail David himself had started to uncover. We compiled it all into a neat package. This time there was no public spectacle. There was no gala, no live stream. That was for Arthur, the man who craved the spotlight. Frank was a creature of the shadows, and that's where we would defeat him. I handed everything over to Raymond, who passed it directly to the federal investigators, who were still sorting through the wreckage of Arthur's life. They took it seriously. A quiet investigation was launched. There were no news alerts on my phone, no reporters swarming a hotel, just the slow, methodical turning of the wheels of justice. Several months later, I got a call from Lauren. Her voice was light, free of the weight it had carried when she first walked into my office. "They arrested him this morning," she said, a mix of relief and tears in her voice. "Frank Russell, it's over. It's finally over." I felt a profound sense of closure. My journey, which had started with a secret message in a used car, was complete. It wasn't just about my brother anymore. It was about Lauren's father, Donald, and all the others. David's fight had become my fight, and now it was finished. I still drive that blue sedan. It's a part of my story now. It reminds me that sometimes the truth takes a detour, but with a little help, it always finds its way to the final destination. The road ahead was no longer just clear. It was peaceful. The arrests of Arthur and Frank felt like the final page of a long, dark book. My life, which had been put on hold, could finally move forward. The fund in David's name was my focus, a quiet way to turn something terrible into something good. Lauren became a close friend and a partner in the project. We were a small team, but we were dedicated. We weren't just giving out money. We were giving people the support system my brother and her father never had. The quiet I had found wasn't the empty silence of before, but the peaceful quiet of a job well done. I thought the story was over, but the past has a way of sending echoes when you least expect it. About a year after Frank's conviction, I received a carefully written letter. It was sent to the fund's post office box, not my home address. The writer said she had followed the news about Arthur and Frank and needed to speak with me about something only she knew. She wrote that she wasn't a victim, but a tool they had used, and the guilt was a heavy burden. She signed it with only a first name, Cheryl. My lawyer, Raymond, advised caution. This could be a trap, Walter, or someone looking for money. But something in the letter's tone felt genuine. It felt like a confession waiting to happen. Against Raymond's advice, I agreed to meet her in a public place. Cheryl was a woman in her late 50s, with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup. She had been a manager at a small independent bank that Arthur used for his initial operations. "Frank approached me years ago," she began, her voice low and steady. "He knew about my son's medical bills. He knew I was desperate. It wasn't a threat, not at first. It was an offer of help." She explained how Frank had her approve a series of loans and transfers that looked legitimate on the surface, but were designed to bleed money from a target company. She was the inside person who made the financial magic trick work. I told myself it was just business, that I wasn't hurting anyone directly. But then I saw the news about your brother, Walter, and about Lauren's father. I realized I wasn't just moving numbers. I was helping them destroy lives. She slid a thin folder across the table. They didn't just target David and Donald. There were others, at least 4 more that I know of. Inside the folder were names of small, family-owned businesses across the country. All of them had failed under mysterious circumstances over the past 15 years. All had banking records that passed through her old branch. Frank and Arthur had a system, Cheryl said, her voice cracking. They were like sharks that could smell a drop of blood in the water. They'd find a business with a small debt or an internal problem, and Frank would engineer a crisis. Then Arthur would sweep in, looking like a savior, only to pick the bones clean. She wasn't seeking forgiveness or money. She was seeking to unburden her conscience by giving me the truth. I left that meeting feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I had fought my war and won. David's name was clear. Frank and Arthur were in prison, but the battle was over. The war, I now realized, was much bigger. These other names in the folder, these other families, were still living with the lies, just as I had. They still believed their fathers, mothers, or siblings had failed. They were carrying the same shame that had almost consumed my family. That night I couldn't sleep. The peace I had worked so hard to find felt fragile, incomplete. It felt selfish. I had found justice for my brother, but what about the others who were still lost in the dark with no GPS message to guide them? The next morning, I called Lauren and told her everything. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. "We have to find them, Walter. We have to tell them the truth." There was no hesitation in her voice, only the same steely resolve I had seen when she first walked into my office. I then spoke with Raymond, who, after reviewing Cheryl's documents, agreed this was a major breakthrough. He started the process of contacting the federal investigators with the new information, but we knew the legal process would be slow. These families needed to hear the truth now. The David's Hope Fund had a new, urgent mission. It wasn't just about helping new businesses start. It was about helping old wounds finally heal. Our first visit was to a man named Jesse, an elderly man living in a small town a few hours away. His family had run a successful textile company for 2 generations. According to Cheryl's files, his was one of the first businesses Arthur and Frank had destroyed. We found him living in a small, modest house, a shadow of the life he once had. He was hesitant at first, his eyes full of the weary distrust of a man who had been kicked by the world too many times. We sat in his living room, surrounded by faded photographs of a factory and smiling employees. I told him my story first. I told him about David, about the lies, and about the message in the car. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of recognition in his old eyes. Lauren then told him about her father, Donald. Finally, we showed him the documents from Cheryl, showing the same pattern of financial manipulation, the same ghost companies, the same slow, deliberate destruction. Jesse listened in complete silence, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When we finished, he didn't speak for a long time. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. "I thought it was my fault," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion held back for 2 decades. "They all said I was too old, that I couldn't keep up. I believed them." In that moment, I understood the true meaning of justice. It wasn't the satisfaction of seeing your enemy fall. It was the relief in another man's eyes when a burden he carried for a lifetime was finally lifted. My personal quest for revenge was over, but a new journey had begun. It was a quieter, slower path, not fueled by rage, but by a shared sense of humanity. I still have the car. It's more than just a machine to me now. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys aren't about reaching a destination, but about finding others along the road who need a guide to help them find their way home to the truth. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt like I wasn't driving it alone. Leaving Jesse's house felt different from leaving the courthouse after Frank's conviction. That had been a victory, sharp and final like the closing of a cell door. This was something else. It was quieter, more profound. It was like watching a wilted plant finally get the water it needed, seeing life slowly return to it. Lauren was quiet on the drive back, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. I knew she was thinking about her own father, Donald, and how much a visit like this would have meant to him. There were no grand speeches between us, just a shared understanding. The David's Hope Fund had found its true calling. A few days later, we were back in my small office, which had become our headquarters. The thin folder from Cheryl was open on the table between us. Jesse's name had a small check mark next to it. 3 names remained. Our next target was a family in a city about a day's drive away. The victim was a man named Alfred, who had owned a successful regional construction company. He had passed away a decade ago, officially from a heart attack, but his family had lost everything just months before. According to Cheryl's notes, Frank had used a manufactured supply chain crisis to bankrupt him, allowing Arthur to buy his equipment for pennies on the dollar. His children, Margaret and Brian, run a small hardware store now, Lauren said, pointing to a line in our research. They were just kids when it happened. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Another family forced to live with the shadow of a failure that wasn't their own. We made the call, Margaret answered. Her voice was cautious, tired. When I mentioned her father's old company, the caution turned to a cold wall of suspicion. I didn't push. I just told her my name and said I had information about her father that she deserved to hear. I explained that we would be in her city in 2 days and asked for just 30 minutes of her time. After a long silence, she agreed. Fine, at the store, after we close. The hardware store was a small, clean place on a quiet street. It smelled of sawdust and paint. Margaret was in her late 30s with her father's kind eyes but a posture that spoke of years of defensive struggle. Her younger brother Brian stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of distrust and challenge. He looked like a young man ready for a fight. "You've got 30 minutes, Brian said, his voice flat. I started our story the same way we had with Jesse, by talking about David. I laid out the deception, the pain of believing a lie, and the single message in the car that changed everything. Lauren then spoke about Donald, her voice steady as she described the slow poisoning of a good man's reputation. Brian just scoffed. So what? You're telling us some big conspiracy destroyed our father? We were there. He made bad deals. He trusted the wrong people. It happens. His words were meant to be tough, but I could hear the deep, old wound beneath them. He was protecting a scar he had lived with his whole life. He didn't make bad deals, I said gently. Bad deals were made for him. Your father was a target. I slid a copy of Cheryl's documents across the counter. I showed them the transfers, the ghost suppliers Frank had created, the same pattern that had ruined my brother and Lauren's father. Margaret picked up the papers, her hands trembling slightly, just as Cheryl's had. She scanned the names of the shell corporations. Arthur lied about David, and the truth is hidden in 4 locations. What do you think Arthur's secret is, and what dangers await me? Comment your theories and share this mystery. Brian remained unmoved. These are just papers. They could be fake. What do you want from us? Money? Are you trying to get us to join some lawsuit? Lauren shook her head. We don't want anything. We're here to give you something. The truth. Your father wasn't a failure. He was robbed by the same men who robbed our families. They are in federal prison now for what they did. Margaret looked up from the documents, her eyes wide. Wait, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That name, Russell, Frank Russell. I remember that name. She left the room and came back a minute later, carrying a dusty old ledger. My dad kept notes on everything. After it all fell apart, he would just sit and read this, trying to figure out where he went wrong. She flipped through the brittle pages. Her finger stopped on an entry dated 15 years ago. Here, she said, her voice cracking. A meeting with Mr. Russell to secure a new cement contract. A deal my dad said would save the company. She looked at the documents in her hand, then back at the ledger. The pieces were connecting right in front of her eyes. This was the deal that bankrupted him, she said, looking at Brian. The disbelief in her brother's face finally began to crumble, replaced by a wave of confusion and dawning horror. He had built his whole identity around the story of his father's failure, perhaps as a way to motivate himself never to make the same mistakes. Now that foundation was turning to sand. He sank onto a nearby stool, burying his face in his hands. We stayed for another hour, answering their questions, filling in the gaps. The anger and suspicion were gone, replaced by a quiet, heavy grief, but it was a new kind of grief. It was for the man they had lost, not for the failure they had been taught to believe in. As we left, Margaret gripped my hand. Thank you, she said, tears streaming down her face. You've given us our father back. The drive home that night felt even more significant than the last. We had done it again. We had delivered the truth. The road ahead felt clearer than ever. But I was naive to think our journey would be that simple. The past doesn't just leave echoes. Sometimes it sends out sentinels to guard its secrets. The next evening, my phone rang. It was an unlisted number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a voice that sounded like polished steel. Am I speaking with Walter? The man asked. He didn't wait for a confirmation. My name is Paul. I'm an attorney who used to handle some business for Mr. Frank Russell's associates. It has come to our attention that you are traveling the country, stirring up old memories. His tone wasn't threatening, but the message was chillingly clear. You fought your battle and you won, Paul continued, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. You cleared your brother's name. You have your fund. Congratulations. But some stories are better left as they are. Digging up old graves can release things you're not prepared to handle. The line went dead. I stood in my quiet living room, the phone still pressed to my ear, a cold dread creeping up my spine. The war wasn't just bigger than I thought. It was still being fought, and we had just appeared on the enemy's radar. The silence after the click of the phone was heavier than any sound. The voice of the man, Paul, echoed in my head, cold and precise. It wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was a statement of fact, delivered like a doctor giving a bad diagnosis. Digging up old graves can release things you're not prepared to handle. For a few moments I was frozen. The quiet comfort of my living room felt like a trap. The shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen, hiding unseen eyes. My first instinct was to drop everything, to take the win I already had, and disappear back into my quiet life. David's name was cleared. Frank and Arthur were in jail. Wasn't that enough? But then I thought of Jesse's face, the tear rolling down his cheek as decades of shame washed away. I thought of Margaret and Brian, finally understanding that their father was a hero, not a failure. This was bigger than my fear. I took a deep breath, my heart still pounding against my ribs, and called called Lauren. I explained the call, repeating Paul's words as best I could remember them. Her response came without a second of hesitation. "So they know about us," she said, her voice tight but not with fear. It was with anger. "Good. Let them know. It just proves we're getting close to something they still want to hide." The next morning we met at my office. The air was thick with a new kind of tension. Before, our mission felt like correcting a historical wrong. Now it felt like we were walking into an active fight. I told Lauren my fear. "These aren't just old associates," I said, pacing the small room. This felt organized, professional. Paul wasn't some cheap lawyer trying to scare us. He was delivering a message. Lauren nodded, her eyes fixed on the folder from Cheryl lying on the desk. "All the more reason to keep going, Walter. We have 2 families left. We can't stop now." What would that say to Jesse and Margaret? That the truth only matters if it's safe to tell? She was right. Stopping now would be a betrayal of everything we had started. We looked at the next name on the list. It was a man named Howard, who had owned a small but innovative software company in the early days of the internet. He lost everything in a hostile takeover orchestrated by one of Arthur's shell corporations. Howard had passed away 5 years ago from a sudden illness, leaving behind a son, Andrew. Our research showed Andrew was now a software engineer himself, living in a city a few hours north. We decided he would be our next visit. We would leave the following day. That night, something changed. I came back to the office late to pick up some papers I'd forgotten. As I put my key in the lock, I noticed something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. I pushed it open slowly. The office was a mess. It hadn't been robbed in the typical sense. My old computer and the petty cash box were untouched, but the file cabinets were open, papers were strewn across the floor, and the desk drawers were pulled out. They had been looking for something specific. My eyes darted to the desk. The folder from Cheryl was gone. My first feeling was a wave of panic. That folder was our only proof, our roadmap. But then a second thought hit me. I had taken it home with me to prepare for the trip to see Andrew. It was safe in my apartment. The break-in was a clumsy, desperate attempt. They were scared, and they were sloppy. It told me everything I needed to know. The threat from Paul wasn't just a warning. It was the first move from an enemy who was still watching, still trying to protect the secrets of the past. They didn't know we had already made digital copies of every single page in that folder, stored safely online. When I told Lauren what happened, her resolve hardened into something sharp and unbreakable. "They're not just guarding old graves, Walter," she said over the phone, her voice a low growl. "There's something still alive in there." We knew we couldn't delay. The next morning, we set out to meet Andrew. The drive was different this time. I kept checking my rearview mirror, watching every car that stayed behind us for too long. The world no longer felt safe and predictable. It felt like a place where shadows had teeth. We were no longer just messengers of truth. We were now guardians of a dangerous secret, and its keepers knew our names. Andrew lived in a modern apartment complex with glass balconies. He was a young man, probably in his early 30s, with the same thoughtful eyes I saw in the old pictures of his father. He let us in cautiously, leading us to a minimalist living room with a large computer set up against one wall. He didn't offer us a seat right away. "You said on the phone you had information about my father's company," he said, his arms crossed. "I've heard stories my whole life. Most of them are from people who want something. So what is it you want?" I started our story, the same one I had told the others, about David and the message in the car. As I spoke, I watched his posture change, his arms uncrossed. He leaned against his desk, his expression shifting from suspicion to intense focus. Lauren then told him about her father and about the pattern we had discovered, a pattern of deliberate ruin. Finally, I pulled out copies of the documents related to his father's company. I showed him the forged invoices from non-existent suppliers and the rapid stock manipulation that had forced his father to sell. Andrew stared at the papers, his face pale. "My dad always said something was wrong," he said quietly, almost to himself. "He said the numbers didn't make sense. Everyone told him he was stressed, that he was imagining things." He looked up at us, and for the first time, I saw the deep well of his family's pain. A week before he lost the company, he got a phone call. He never told me who it was from, but he told me to never, ever trust a man who makes promises that sound too good to be true. He said, "They're trying to bury us, son. Don't let them." He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled down a small, leather-bound journal. He tried to investigate. He hired a private detective, a man named Francis. 2 weeks later, the detective called him and quit. He sounded terrified. He just said, "Stop digging. It's not worth it." My father gave up after that. He said he couldn't put our family in danger. The name Francis wasn't in our files. This was new information. The network was bigger, the intimidation more direct than we had even realized. Paul's phone call to me wasn't the beginning. It was just a continuation of a tactic they had used for decades. We stayed and answered Andrew's questions for another hour. As we left, he shook my hand firmly. "Thank you," he said. "You've explained the last puzzle piece of my father's life. Be careful. You're not just fighting ghosts." We had one name left on our list, a woman named Virginia. We knew the final visit would be the most important one, but we also knew we weren't just driving toward her. We were driving deeper into a war that had never truly ended. The drive back from Andrew's apartment was quiet but charged. The name Francis, the private investigator investigator who got scared off, hung in the air between me and Lauren. It was a ghost we hadn't known existed, proof that the intimidation tactics were old and effective. Paul's phone call makes more sense now, Lauren said, breaking the silence as we drove through the dark city streets. This isn't just about protecting a reputation that's already ruined. Frank and Arthur are in jail. This is about protecting someone else, someone who is still out there, still has something to lose. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. She was right. We weren't just uncovering a historical crime. We had stumbled into the den of an animal that was still very much alive, and we had just poked it with a stick. The break-in at my office, the call from Paul, it was all a warning. Stay away. But we only had one name left. Virginia. We set out for her home the next morning. The address was in a small, quiet town several hours away, the kind of place people go to disappear. The drive felt heavy. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like a threat. The open road, which once felt like freedom, now felt like exposure. We were out in the open, and the enemy knew what we were doing. "Are you okay?" Lauren asked, noticing my tense posture. "I'm just thinking," I said, "about how this all started with a car, a simple, used car. It feels like I was given a key to a door I never knew existed, and now that it's open, I can't close it." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Maybe you were never meant to close it, Walter. Maybe you were meant to walk through it." Virginia lived in a small, well-kept house at the end of a gravel lane. A garden of roses, perfectly tended, lined the walkway. It was a picture of peaceful retirement, but the steel security door and the camera mounted above the porch told a different story. An older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back tightly answered the door. She looked us up and down, her expression a wall of suspicion. "Yes?" she asked, her voice clear and firm. She didn't open the security door. "My name is Walter, and this is Lauren," I began. "We're here to talk about a company your late husband, George, used to own. It's about Arthur and Frank Russell." At the mention of those names, a flicker of something, fear, or maybe just old pain, crossed her face before the wall went back up. "I have nothing to say about those men," she said, preparing to close the inner door. "Please," Lauren interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "My father was Stanley. He was one of them too." That stopped her. She stared at Lauren for a long moment. Then slowly she unlocked the security door and let us in. Her living room was filled with books and photos of children and grandchildren. It was a shrine to a life built after a storm. We sat on a floral sofa that felt too soft for the tension in the room. We told her everything, starting from the message in the GPS, showing her the documents from Cheryl's folder, explaining the pattern of ruin that connected our families. She listened without a word, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When we finished, she finally spoke, her voice a low, steady current of controlled anger. "You think they just ruined him financially?" she said, her sharp eyes fixed on me. "They did more than that. My George wasn't just a businessman, he was an honest man, and they killed him for it." The air in the room grew cold. Lauren and I exchanged a look. This was deeper and darker than we had imagined. "My husband wasn't the numbers guy," Virginia explained. I was his accountant. I saw what they were doing. Arthur was creating fake orders, billing our company for services from shell corporations that didn't exist. It was a slow, methodical bleed. She said she confronted George with the evidence, urging him to go to the police. He agreed. He was going to expose the whole thing. The day before he was set to meet with investigators, Virginia continued, her voice trembling for the first time, he had a heart attack. A sudden, massive heart attack. The doctors said it was stress. He was only 42 years old. She took a shaky breath. 2 days after the funeral, a man came to this house. He was polite, well-dressed. He sat right where you're sitting. She pointed to the armchair across from us. He told me he was an associate of Mr. Russell. He said George's death was a tragedy, a result of unnecessary stress. He said it would be a shame if my children had to endure any more stress. The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. His name was Louis, she said, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. He told me to forget everything I knew. He said the past was the past, and that some things are better left buried. He made it clear what would happen to my family if I ever dug them up. This was him. This was the man Paul worked for. Louis was the enforcer, the one they sent to make sure the graves stayed sealed. For decades, Virginia had lived with that fear. She raised her children, built a new life, but always looked over her shoulder. She never spoke a word of it to anyone. "But I kept something," she said, her eyes now glinting with a fire I recognized. It was the same fire I felt in myself, the fire of a story that refused to die. She went to a heavy wooden bookshelf and pulled out a thick, leather-bound copy of a classic novel. The inside was hollowed out. From it, she removed a small, thin ledger book and a single cassette tape. "George was smarter than they thought," she said, placing them on the coffee table. "He recorded his last phone call with Arthur, the one where Arthur admits to the scheme and laughs about it. And this ledger, this has all the real numbers, the ones ones I kept off the official books. It's my proof. She pushed the items across the table toward us. I'm an old woman now, Virginia said, her voice full of a sudden fierce strength. My children are grown and safe. I'm not scared of men like Louis anymore. But you two, you are young. Taking this is more dangerous than you can possibly imagine. This isn't just about money or reputation. It's about what they did to keep it. We sat in silence, staring at the book and the tape. This was it. The truth the first owner of my car wanted me to find. It wasn't just a story of corporate greed. It was a story of threats, of fear, and of a man who died for trying to do the right thing. Lauren reached out and placed her hand on the ledger. We'll take it, she said. We'll finish what our father started. The drive home was a world away from the one that brought us here. The fear of being watched was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Purpose. We weren't just messengers anymore. We were carrying the weapon that could finally end the war. The ledger and the cassette tape sat on the passenger seat between us, feeling heavier than a bag of cement. Every mile we put between ourselves and Virginia's quiet house felt like a mile deeper into enemy territory. I drove with my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights that had been behind us for the last 20 minutes finally turned off onto a side road, and I only let out the breath I was holding when they were gone. Lauren was silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the quiet of two soldiers in a trench listening for the next attack. He came to her house, I said, breaking the quiet. Louis, he just sat there and threatened her and her children. Lauren stared out at the dark road. They're not gangsters from the movies, Walter. They're worse. They wear suits and smile while they tell you how they're going to destroy your family. We went to her apartment. It felt safer than mine. After the break-in at my office, my own home felt like a glass house. Lauren made coffee while I stared at the two objects on her kitchen table. The ledger looked plain, but the cassette tape looked like a relic from another time. It was a small black rectangle that held a dead man's voice and a truth that had been buried for decades. Let's listen to it first, she said, placing a mug of coffee next to my hand. She pulled out an old cassette player from a closet, a dusty machine she probably hadn't used in years. With a click, she put the tape in and pressed play. The machine hissed for a few seconds, and then a voice filled the room. I know what you're doing, Arthur, a man said. His voice was steady but tight with anger. It had to be George. Then another voice responded, and my blood ran cold. It was Arthur, younger, but unmistakably him. His tone was light, almost amused. George, he said, like he was talking to a child. You're stressed. The business is tough. You're seeing ghosts where there are none. George's voice cut back in, sharp now. Ghosts? I have the invoices, Arthur, from companies that don't exist. I have the bank transfers. You're bleeding us dry. There was a short laugh from Arthur. Bleeding you? I'm giving you a lifeline. You were sinking. I just found a more creative way to stay afloat. It's business. The coldness of his words was shocking. He wasn't even trying to deny it. He was proud. This is theft, George said, his voice rising. I'm going to the police. It's over. The next words from Arthur on that tape will haunt me forever. No, you're not, he said, his voice losing all its fake friendliness and turning into something hard and sharp as glass. You're going to go home to your lovely wife. What's her name? Virginia. And your kids. You're going to forget this conversation ever happened. Because some things, George, are not worth the stress. Stress can be very, very bad for your health. Do you understand what I'm saying? It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence. The tape ended with a click. Lauren and I just sat there, the hiss of the empty tape filling the room. They didn't just ruin him. They threatened him, and his heart gave out. They killed him just as surely as if they had used a weapon. After the tape, the ledger was just confirmation. Page after page of neat handwriting, Virginia's handwriting, showed the real numbers next to the fake ones. It was a perfect map of the crime, detailed and undeniable. We now had everything, the story, the pattern, and the proof, but we also had the full attention of a man named Louis, and whoever he worked for. We can't go to the police, Lauren said, finally turning off the cassette player. Not yet. Francis, the private investigator, was scared off. The police might have someone on the inside. We have no idea how deep this goes. She was right. We had one shot at this. If we gave this evidence to the wrong person, it would disappear, and so would we. Lauren went to her bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded piece of paper. My dad was a careful man, she said. He always told me, if you're ever in real trouble, the kind of trouble where the law can't or won't help you, there are still a few good people. This is his list. She unfolded the paper. It had 3 names on it. 2 of them had lines drawn through them with the word retired written next to them, but the third name was clear, Mark. Next to it was a phone number and a note. Journalist. Bites harder than a bulldog. Can't be bought. This was our chance. A journalist with a reputation for taking on the powerful was exactly what we needed. We needed to get the story out to the public, to shine a light so bright they couldn't hide anymore. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing Arthur's voice from the tape, the casual cruelty of it. The next morning, as I was leaving my apartment to meet Lauren, I saw it. A dark, nondescript car was parked across the street, the same model I had seen near my office after the break-in. There was a man in the driver's seat just sitting there, not looking at his phone, just watching. He wasn't trying to hide. He wanted to be seen. It was a message from Louis. We see you. We are always watching. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to walk calmly to my car, get in, and drive away. I didn't look back. I knew he was still there. When I got to Lauren's, I told her about the car. Her face became a mask of grim determination. "We don't have time to be scared, Walter," she said. "We have to do this now." She handed me the piece of paper with the journalist's number. "You call him. You have the car, the original message. The story starts with you." I took a deep breath, my hand shaking slightly as I pulled out my phone. I dialed the number. The fate of our families, our very lives, now resting on this one call to a man I had never met. The phone rang once, twice, then a gruff voice answered. "Mark speaking." My throat was dry. I had to force the words out. "My name is Walter. I have a story for you. A big one." I could almost hear him rolling his eyes through the phone. "Listen, kid. Everyone thinks they have a big story," Mark said, his voice like gravel. "What's it about? A corrupt local official? A pothole on your street?" The dismissal in his tone almost made me hang up. But then I thought of David, of George, of Stanley. I thought of Virginia living in fear for decades. "It's about Arthur and Frank Russell," I said, my voice finding its strength. "It's about fraud, threats, and a man who died because of them, my brother." There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was just a second, but it felt like an hour. The background noise of what sounded like a busy newsroom faded away. "Where did you hear those names?" Mark asked, his voice suddenly sharp, all the boredom gone. "It doesn't matter where," I replied, glancing at Lauren, who gave me a nod of encouragement. "What matters is that I have proof. I have a ledger with their real accounting, and I have a recording, a tape of Arthur threatening a business partner right before he died of a heart attack." The silence that followed was different. It was the sound of a predator that had just caught a scent. "Don't say another word on this phone," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't talk about this with anyone else, do you understand?" "Yes," I breathed. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow, at noon, go to the public library downtown, the big one. Go to the 3rd floor. The history section. Find the aisle on Brazilian independence. There will be a man there, an older man with white hair, reading a thick book with a blue cover. His name is Oscar. Don't talk to him. Just sit at the table at the end of that aisle and wait. He will leave his book on the table when he goes. Inside the book will be a key and an address. Go to that address alone. Come in a car you've never used before if you can. A rental, a taxi, anything but your own. And for God's sake, make sure you're not followed." The line went dead. Lauren and I looked at each other, a new kind of fear dawning. This was real. The precautions he was taking told us just how dangerous these men truly were. This wasn't a game. The next morning was a storm of anxiety. We couldn't use my car, the one that started all this, and Lauren's was probably being watched too. We walked 10 blocks in the opposite direction of the library before calling a ride-sharing service, my eyes scanning every car that passed, every person on the street. The library felt like a sanctuary, quiet and orderly, a world away from the chaos we were in. On the 3rd floor, just as Mark had said, we found the aisle. An older man, Oscar, sat at a table, completely absorbed in a large blue book. We sat at the other end, pretending to look at old maps. It was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Finally, Oscar closed his book, stood up, and walked away, leaving it on the table. He never even looked at us. My hand shook as I picked it up. Inside, just as promised, were a small key and a slip of paper with an address for a commercial building across town. We took another car to the address. It was a nondescript building, home to a dozen small businesses. The key was for a small office on the 2nd floor, Suite 2B. The name on the door was fake, Importações e Comércio Geral. Inside, the office was sparse, just a metal desk, 3 chairs, and Mark. He was older than his voice suggested, maybe in his late 60s, with tired eyes that had seen too much but missed nothing. He didn't waste time with introductions. "Let me see it," he said. Lauren placed the ledger on the desk and I put the old cassette player next to it. I pressed play. We all listened in silence as George's desperate anger and Arthur's cold, chilling threats filled the small room once more. When the tape ended with that final ominous click, Mark just sat there for a long moment staring at the little machine. He finally looked up at us, and for the first time, I saw something other than a hardened journalist. I saw a flicker of profound anger. "I've been hearing whispers about Russell and Arthur for 15 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. "Rumors of hostile takeovers, partners who suddenly retired or went broke. But I never had anything solid, just smoke. This," he tapped the cassette player, "this is a fire." He opened the ledger and flipped through the pages, his eyes moving quickly, absorbing Virginia's neat columns of numbers. "This is the map of their entire operation. It's beautiful. It's perfect." He looked at us, his expression serious. "You two have no idea what you're holding. This isn't just a story about money. Men like Louis don't get involved for simple fraud. This goes deeper." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Here's what happens now. You give me this evidence, I make copies, and the originals go into a safe deposit box that only my lawyer can access if something happens to me. You two go home. You live your lives. You act normal. Go to work. Pay your bills. Don't talk to each other on the phone. Don't meet in private. They are watching you, and they need to believe you've hit a dead end, that you've given up." The thought of doing nothing was maddening, but I saw the logic in it. We were bait, and as long as we seemed harmless, the sharks might not bite. "When will you publish it?" Lauren asked. "Not Not until it's ready, Mark said. I'm not just going to write an article. We're going to drop a bomb. I'm going to find other victims. I'm going to track the money. I'm going to connect every dot. When this story comes out, it will be on the front page of every paper and the lead story on every news channel in the country. There will be nowhere for them to hide. He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. This will take time, maybe weeks, maybe a couple of months. The most dangerous part for you is now. This waiting period. Be smart, be boring, and stay alive. We left the ledger and the tape with him. Walking out of that building and back into the sunlight felt strange. We had handed our weapon to someone else and now we were defenseless again. But we also felt a sliver of hope. For the first time, we weren't alone. We had a bulldog on our side. The drive back in another anonymous car was silent. The city looked the same, but for us, everything had changed. We were no longer just two people seeking answers. We were part of a war, soldiers behind enemy lines, waiting for the signal to attack, and we could only pray that we would survive to see the victory. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Mark's instruction to be boring sounded simple, but it was a special kind of torture. Every day was a performance. I went to work, smiled at my colleagues, talked about the weather, and came home. I cooked simple meals and watched mindless shows on TV. But underneath that calm surface, my mind was a storm. Every car that slowed down on my street was Lewis's man. Every unknown number on my phone was a threat. I felt like a ghost in my own life, just waiting for a sign, any sign, that the fight was still happening somewhere beyond my quiet apartment walls. Lauren and I followed the rules perfectly. No calls, no texts, no secret meetings. We saw each other at a distance sometimes, in the supermarket or passing on the street, and we'd give a small, almost invisible nod. It was a silent promise. I'm still here. I haven't given up. The man in the dark car was gone, which was somehow more unnerving than when he was there. The silence felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. It was the waiting, the not knowing, that chewed away at you. We had given our only weapon to Mark, and now we were just exposed, hoping his shield was strong enough. About a month into our forced hibernation, the silence was broken. It wasn't a loud crash, but a quiet, chilling phone call. It was for Lauren. She called me from a public phone, her voice tight with a fear I hadn't heard before. "Walter, they didn't come after me," she said, her words rushing out. "They went after my mother, Virginia." My stomach turned to ice. Of course, they wouldn't target us directly. That would be too obvious. They went for the weakest link, the woman who had already been broken by them once. A man had called Virginia's house. He didn't threaten her, not directly. His name was Michael, he'd said. He was from a company that reviewed old insurance claims. He just wanted to ask a few questions about her late husband, George. It was just routine, he assured her. But Virginia, who had lived in the shadow of that fear for decades, knew exactly what it was. It was a message from Louis, delivered with a polite corporate smile. He just kept asking if she was happy in her home, Lauren told me, her voice trembling with rage. He asked if she felt safe. He told her stress was a terrible thing for a woman her age. It was the same threat they used on her husband, wrapped in different words. They were telling her, "We know where you are, and we can get to you." We couldn't sit back and be boring any longer. This changed everything. We met that night in a crowded public park, sitting on a bench like strangers, watching children play on the swings. "We have to get her out of there," I said, my voice low. "Now, tonight." Lauren nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I know. I'm going to bring her to my place. They won't expect that. They think she's alone and scared." She was right. It was a bold move, but it was the only one we had. While Lauren went to get her mother, my job was to get a message to Mark. I couldn't call him. I couldn't go to the office. I had to use the system he set up. I went back to the downtown library, my heart pounding with a familiar rhythm of fear. I found the history section, the same aisle as before. I didn't know if Oscar would be there, but I had to try. I left a simple note inside a book about Brazilian history. "The package is fragile. They are trying to break it. We had to move it to a safe place." It was vague, but I prayed Mark would understand. I left the library without looking back, feeling like I had just lit a fuse and was now running from the explosion. We were no longer hiding. We had moved a piece on the board, and now we had to wait for their response. For 2 days, there was nothing. Lauren had moved Virginia into her small apartment. The old woman was terrified, but also angry. Seeing her daughter fight back had ignited a spark in her that had been dormant for years. On the third day, Mark responded. A simple, unsigned letter appeared under my door. It contained just 7 words. "The storm will break at dawn tomorrow." Dawn. It was happening. The article was ready. The bomb was about to drop. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I just sat by the window, watching the dark sky, waiting for the sun and the storm it would bring. And then it broke. It wasn't just a front-page story. It was an earthquake. Mark hadn't just written an article. He had unleashed a war. The headline was massive. "The Russell Arthur Empire, a 30-year trail of fraud, threats, and ruined lives." The story was everywhere. On every news channel, every website, every radio station. They played snippets of the tape, Arthur's cold, menacing voice filling the airwaves. They showed copies of Virginia's ledger, the 2 sets of numbers side by side, a perfect picture of their crimes. Mark had found other victims too, families of other business partners who had suddenly retired or died of stress. It wasn't just David's story or George's story anymore. It was a national scandal. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Arthur and Frank Russell were arrested before noon that day, pulled from their high-rise offices in front of news cameras. Their faces, usually so confident and powerful, were masks of shock and disbelief. They had believed they were untouchable, gods in their own world. But Mark had shown a light so bright, there were no shadows left to hide in. The investigation expanded. The police, now under national scrutiny, had no choice but to act. They started looking into Louis, the quiet fixer, and his associate Michael. The whole criminal enterprise began to unravel. A week later, Lauren, Virginia, and I sat in my apartment. The news was still buzzing, but the immediate danger had passed. Virginia was holding a framed picture of her husband, George. For the first time since I'd met her, she was smiling a real smile. "He would be so proud," she said softly. Looking at Lauren, "He would be proud of both of you. We had won. It wasn't a clean victory. It wouldn't bring David or George back. The scars would always be there. But it was justice. The kind of justice that felt impossible just a few months ago. The truth, hidden away in a used car's GPS, had finally come out. My brother wasn't a failure. He was a hero who had tried to stop them. And now, finally, everyone knew it. My quest for vengeance was over. But what I found wasn't just revenge. It was peace. The quiet life I had before was gone, but the one that replaced it was built on truth. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt like I could finally breathe again. My investigation into David's death, guided by a secret GPS message, is over. The truth about Arthur's betrayal has been revealed. What did you think of my journey? Subscribe for more gripping stories like this.